Good game, bad remake is often how I hear Resident Evil 3 Remake described. But I think, before it can even try to be a remake, it fails as a game first and foremost. I'm not someone who grew up with the original 3 Resident Evil games, so when I heard Resident Evil 3 Remake described as this, I assumed this meant I would enjoy it because I had no emotional connection to the source material. Nope. I hated it even as a standalone title, and today I'm going to explore that. Here's why Resident Evil 3 Remake isn't just a bad remake, but a bad game overall. You start the game in first person, playing as Jill Valentine having a bad dream. We'll see 2 of these sequences in the game, and while they show off a lot of visual flair, the only thing they really have to say for it is that Jill is traumatized from the Spencer Mansion incident in Resident Evil 1. This trauma and fear is something I wish the game explored way more, but it only touches on it in these 2 dream cutscenes, with it quite literally never being addressed in the rest of the game. What I liked so much about the Resident Evil 2 remake, and the Resident Evil 4 remake, and Resident Evil Requiem especially, was that all 3 of these games really expanded on Leon's trauma, and how it informs his actions. Resident Evil 3 Remake does none of that with Jill, and it's very disappointing. After the dream, you're able to explore Jill's apartment, which in full honesty, is a pretty nice detail. I do like the little bits of extra lore you get access to in the game's opening minutes. After a quick phone call with Brad, warning Jill to get out of there, you run into Nemesis, the first problem in the game, and get ready because there's going to be a lot of those. There are many things I could say about Nemesis, most of them being pretty negative, but I'll talk about most of my complaints for him later. For now, let's go over my most prevalent complaint about Resident Evil 3 Remake. Forced walking. This game forces you to walk so much. I remember going over my experience with the game and keeping my friend updated on how my playthrough was going, and a substantial amount of my commentary was calling this game, quote, W key simulator, because so much of the game is walking forward. You're going to see a lot of it here, and I guarantee you, the first 20 or so minutes of the game is nothing but it. That aside, when you finish this glorified cutscene, you're finally introduced to RE3 Remake's Raccoon City. And this is where my next positive comes in, a little bigger than the little bits of lore. This game is absolutely gorgeous, arguably the best looking Resident Evil game. The high contrast between the bright reds and oranges of the fires clashing against the deep blacks and grays of the night sky makes for absolute mastery in art direction. Not to mention the hospital and the facility, where you're often showered in these red and turquoise lights just cascading all over Jill and Carlos. I just got my first OLED monitor very recently, and it looks absolutely stunning on it. And now comes the fun part, getting to play the actual game. Just kidding, more walking in a straight line and watching cutscenes. We have never been less back than we are now. Here you're introduced to Brad in person, who has 2 minutes of screen time and is one of the more useless characters in the game. He saves Jill by holding the door shut to keep the zombies back, which is cool and brave, but it's the only thing he does the entire game, and his only other appearance is as a zombie for you to gun down as Carlos. Here he's just kinda there. It's a pretty awful way to end the character arc of a frankly underrated member of STARS. Like, you know Barry from the first game and how he was awesome and cool and sick as hell? Yeah, imagine if all he did was give Jill the lockpick, call her the master of unlocking, and then fuck off and die off screen. Now imagine the game gives you an AK-47, and the first enemy you find after this is a zombified Barry, as if the game were saying, hey, use him as target practice, we don't give a fuck about him. I don't like how they treated Brad in this game. But what's really funny is that Brad is actually technically the strongest he's ever been here, because of how, at the beginning of the game, it's implied that he was able to successfully evade Nemesis somehow. Some nobody actually has a fantastic video that goes over the way the remake completely misunderstands the characters in depth from the perspective of it being a remake. Go check that out in the link in the description below. And I'll let him speak on how comically strong Brad is implied to be despite the generational aura loss he undergoes just moments later.
In the original game, Brad doesn't evade Nemesis for very long, because the second time you see Brad, Nemesis kills him. Because Nemesis is an unstoppable, relentless pursuer. He knows what he's after and he's not going to stop until he gets it. Except in the remake, where Nemesis entirely gives up on Brad to go after Jill. Off screen, one of two things happened. Either Brad beat the absolute fucking brakes off of Nemesis so bad he decided to go after Jill, or Brad outmaneuvered Nemesis to such an insane degree that Nemesis gave up to go after Jill.
It's buried underneath so many layers of irony that Brad makes Nemesis look weak in the game's opening minutes just by calling Jill on the phone, only for Capcom to metaphorically take this man out back and mag dump him. And even though this is one of the highest points a game's cast has power scaled in the series, everything still feels weak and boring, somehow. But it's all good, because after this you finally get a gun, and we can talk about something I like again. The gunplay. Now this is directly ported over from RE2 Remake, and it shows in how it feels. Every shot feels deliberate, and every fight feels desperate, which is exactly how I like my Resident Evil games to feel. It's an RE engine game. I have more problems with how little I get to interact with the combat than I do with the combat itself. But there is one glaring problem in the gameplay that causes this entire combat system to fall apart. And it's so cruel, it's so unfortunate, it's the dodge roll. This dodge roll trivializes the majority of the game. Getting perfect dodges doesn't require very precise inputs, and even if it's not a perfect dodge, Jill still has invincibility frames during the dodge animation. I understand why it's here, because it was there in the original, but this game already cut out half the content, so I don't understand why they had to keep this intact, especially in the game-breaking state it's in. The game does attempt to balance it out by increasing the dynamic difficulty every time you land a perfect dodge, but it does almost nothing, because it feels like dynamic difficulty is only really tied to enemy health and damage, which is completely meaningless if you're perfect dodging your way through a crowded room. I think the only time the dynamic difficulty really screwed me over at all was when I would perfect dodge multiple times in a row, only to get instant killed in a single hit. But the only positive thing I can say about that is that it was funny. Frustrating, but a bit cartoonish and silly. Anyway, this is where you're introduced to Carlos and
Biohazard Countermeasure Service, UBCS for short.
Comprising Mikhail, Tyrell, Nikolai, and Carlos. The UBCS wants to use the subway to evacuate civilians out of Raccoon City, but the power's down, meaning Jill has to bring the power back on and path a safe way out of the city for the subway. For the most part, the UBCS is rather kind to Jill, with the exception of the Randite sociopath Nikolai, but I'll get to him later. What I really want to talk about is Carlos. Carlos is a weirdly written character, even if you discount the character assassination he and Jill undergo in this game. There are a lot of things that could be said about that, especially in some Nobody's video, but because I'm approaching the game as a standalone title, I'm going to go over the fundamental issues with how he's written in the context of the game itself. If I had to describe Carlos in the RE3 Remake in one sentence, it would be genetically engineered in a lab for TikTok edits. Even if you just compare his design in this game to that of the original, it's pretty clear that the approach was for him to be attractive and likable from the get-go this time around, rather than a selfish merc who owns up to his mistakes and redeems himself later on. But without comparing further, let's go over how well his character at least achieves that, and whether or not it allows him to thrive in the context of the narrative. It's hard to describe, but Carlos's presence often feels forced or contrived. Jill's still Jill Valentine no matter what, so she's gonna have her cool moments, but it feels like a lot of her better qualities from earlier games have been shouldered onto Carlos so that his arrival feels more cathartic during the many times he saves her in this game. Despite being the main character of the game itself, Jill at times feels more like a damsel in distress, and with how little you actually do while playing as her, you feel like every section you're just waiting for Carlos or Mikhail or someone to swoop in and save you in the next cutscene. Don't get me wrong, I love when Resident Evil uses action as a carrot on a stick through the piss-pants horror, I love being able to watch zombies get mowed down after hours of total helplessness. That's why I love RE9, that's why I love RE2 Remake, and that's why I love RE7. Now the problem here is that the game isn't scary, and the action sections don't feel cathartic. There's not a whole lot of reward because you're barely playing the game when it's trying to be scary. So you get through a Jill section and you're like, meh. And then you get to see Carlos and you're like, meh. But, ooh, hot Latino. Speaking of playing the game, it's finally time to get to a fully playable section. Yes, it takes that long before the Resident Evil game finally plays like a Resident Evil game. The city streets section of the game tasks Jill with turning the power in the subway station back on and routing the train correctly, which involves what's admittedly a pretty well-designed exploration puzzle, all things considered. Strewn about are these juicy pieces of lore to help visualize what Raccoon City was like just a day ago, among other side stuff like a quick puzzle to get yourself a dot sight for your pistol. Resident Evil is usually at its best when the levels are designed with this open exploration in mind, where they're almost bite-sized open worlds that gradually expand as you progress. Resident Evil 4 Remake understood this especially well, even implementing a fully fledged side quest system, and I'm glad to see the same ideas are intact here. Now, what I'm not glad to see are the Demoses. You see, when you go to turn on the generators to power the subway station, these pieces of shit come along for the ride. I know they were a part of the original game and they were so much better in it, but here they're just kind of nothing but bad. The maze itself is the game's first attempt at being scary, as it dumps Jill into a dark room with tight hallways and fast enemies. Demoses have a lot of the same elements to them as dogs in other games, nimble enemies with small hitboxes and deadly grapples, theoretically making them horrifying. Now unfortunately, nothing about this game is horrifying because you have a perfect dodge and can just ignore them. Although that's not to say the section didn't make me uneasy, albeit in the wrong ways. You see, when Jill first makes it down to the generator maze, she's attacked by a Deimos in a cutscene so as to introduce you to the parasite status effect. I actually find the parasite effect itself to be a good mechanic, as it forces your hand and requires you to consume your resources. What I don't find to be good, however, is the way the Deimoses actually attack Jill and plant the parasites. The animation of grappling her is vaguely sexual in a deeply uncomfortable sense, and the act of forcing a very phallic-looking tentacle down her throat carries a lot of grotesque implications. It doesn't help that the Deimos is physically planting its offspring into Jill, which holds a lot of disturbing parallels that I don't even think I have to describe, but I found them very distasteful. Now typically, I wouldn't be making this comparison because it's a game about zombies and there's no way Capcom would intentionally make a bug violate Jill that way in canon. I mean, this is the same series where a child predator gets chest bursted in a scene straight out of Alien, or split in half if that's more your speed. But at the same time, the way the attack is depicted feels as on the nose as it can get, as though they were fishing for content creators to say something like, Capcom knew what they were doing. And unfortunately, it undermines the game's already weak attempts to empower Jill. Thankfully, the maze is a very short section, and brain dead enough to navigate that I don't have to talk about it anymore and we can move on. After turning on the generators, we're back in the city streets and can enjoy the fact that the level design is competent again. You're going to notice a lot of up and down as I critique this game because multiple parts of the game breathe life temporarily into the experience that imply the existence of a much better game that just isn't there. And this is shown in the moments immediately after reaching the subway control room, as by that point, you've seen pretty much all there is to see in the streets. You also encounter Nemesis here, and this is where the game once again nosedives into scripted brain rot. Now, the Nemesis versus Mr. X conversation is one that's been done to death, and while I agree with everyone's claims that Remake Nemesis is just too scripted, I feel like the girl from Resident Evil Requiem is proof that a scripted stalker enemy can work incredibly well, as long as it challenges the player's ability to engage with the game's mechanics. Nemesis does none of that. For the most part, he's a reskin of Mr. X that changes very little to cater himself to Resident Evil 3 Remake's movement. He gets a flamethrower with a harder hitbox to dodge in a little bit, and that's pretty much the most the game does for him. He also appears very little outside of when the plot calls for him, and even then is never more than an annoyance. For having the entirety of the original game named after him, I would have expected a lot more of a presence from him. Thankfully, when we're done with this, we can jump into the next good gameplay section, the sewers. Is what I would say if the sewers weren't awful. After escaping Nemesis, Jill needs to find a battery pack so as to open the door on out of the sewers. This means going back to the same gameplay loop as the streets uptown, which is great on paper. Unfortunately, however, the only remotely interesting part of the sewers are the gamma enemies, and even then, you can roll through gammas, not around them, not past their attacks, not through their attacks, through them, and totally trivialize them. And at the dick front of the level, you get a grenade launcher that pretty much deletes them from the game files directly. This area is probably the best example of how the game teases you with proper Resident Evil levels, but doesn't really have much to show for it. The sewers are so bankrupt in gameplay depth or interesting design that you're left deeply disappointed by the missed potential of it all. The good stuff in this game often echoes the genius of other great entries before it, but you play so little of it that you're left thinking, man, I wish I played a better game. The sewers leave just as quickly as they come, as if the devs gave up on fleshing it out and just moved on to the next segment. Good prioritization if they were limited on time, but it still makes for a very disappointing section that I feel could have been a more memorable part of the game with a bit more time in the oven. What makes it worse is that it's immediately followed by a Nemesis Boss fight that further drifts him away from the identity of stalking menace. This is also technically the beginning of Nemesis's evolution gimmick, which I have many complaints about. But the flamethrower is the least egregious that it gets, so I'll bite my tongue for now. The boss fight itself isn't too bad, it's just a simple matter of shooting the weak spot until the guy dies, and then shooting the guy more until he dies again. He has some interesting attacks that demand good memorization if you want to be able to dodge everything and take no damage, but I wouldn't call it difficult by any stretch. You shoot Nemesis, he goes down, and Jill heads back downtown. Not a whole lot happens here, but Jill does end up going into Kendo's gun shop from RE2. The interaction here is short but sweet and demonstrates a little bit of good writing for what feels like the first time in the game. After getting the key to the gate next to the gun shop, we actually hear a pretty haunting exchange between Kendo and his daughter, alluding to what would happen in Resident Evil 2. It's pretty heartbreaking, as is the rest of Kendo's story, and I actually think the remake handled his little amount of screen time exceptionally well. Now, unfortunately... This is RE3 Remake. No fun allowed. Fuck you. Go mag dump Brad and think about what you've done. The two protagonists rendezvous, the new and improved rocket launcher Nemesis, patent pending, chases Jill and Carlos, and they evade him with relative ease. When they reach the subway station, she and the UBCS finally get moving, but not without friction. First off, Carlos and Tyrell stay behind so that they can find Nathaniel Bard, an umbrella scientist they've been tasked with rescuing who's conveniently hiding in the RPD. Yeah, we'll be getting to that later. Mikhail suspects that Nikolai might have killed his own platoon, and Nikolai pretty much confirms this by giving him a shit-eating grin. Before we can ponder this, though, Nemesis attacks the train, and Nikolai immediately confirms he's an asshole by locking Jill on the train with Nemesis. Mikhail then sacrifices himself to shake Nemesis off with some grenades and a very out-of-place one-liner.
Get off my train, shitbird!
This whole section is pretty rough, both before and following, because it's just about entirely made of cutscenes and forced walking, with some bad writing in between. The game really likes to favor cinematic flair over tension and gameplay, and I found myself audibly groaning. Thankfully, the benefit of RE3 Remake's breakneck pacing is that the bad parts are almost as short as the good parts, so as soon as the subway goes awry, we get to play as Carlos and explore the brightest glimpse of good yet, the RPD. This being a rushed game and using RE2 Remake as the basis in terms of overall controls and movement, Carlos plays pretty much identical to Jill in terms of basic gameplay. But he is distinguished by having a far stronger arsenal and not being able to dodge roll. Instead of a dodge, Carlos has a shoulder bash that doubles as a one-button crate opening solution, and when perfectly timed, functions as a parry. This is actually ironically worse than the dodge roll for survivability because it gives Carlos no mobility, which is way more important for navigation than damage or knockback is in most situations. In large part because of how Carlos plays fundamentally, his sections are actually a little scarier than Jill's, despite him being painted in the narrative as the action hero. It's not a massive issue, just something I find funny more than anything. If you haven't noticed, I haven't talked about the story events here, and that's because nothing really happens. Carlos puts together a detonator in this really actually kind of fun puzzle, gets into the STARS office, and finds out that Bard is in the hospital. Yeah, that's kinda it. What I really want to talk about here is the level itself. It's literally the RPD, one of the best designed levels in any game, Resident Evil or otherwise, so it's gonna be a very, very fun level to go around. The C4 puzzle's very fun to navigate, and the atmosphere of the station is as eerie as ever. There are lickers too, which break up the gameplay nicely, even if encounters with them are limited and short-lived. I find the massive uptick in quality in the RPD poetic in a way. That it took the game shifting focus away from the story and ripping an entire level out of an entirely different game for it to get good says a lot about the game itself. It unfortunately understands itself so little that the best part of it is when it rehashes ideas from a game that understood itself perfectly. And even then, this section's still excruciatingly linear compared to the RPD in RE2 and its remake, foregoing much of what made those incarnations so fulfilling to explore. Thankfully, Jill survived the train wreck from earlier, meaning it's time for more straight lines. I love walking in straight lines. I love running in straight lines, even though it's functionally the same as walking in straight lines. Can you tell that I love this game's scripting? So after about 5 odd minutes of moving forward and occasionally firing your weapon, maybe, you get to hear the best line in Resident Evil history.
Bitch can't even swim.
And are immediately thrown into your second Nemesis boss fight, though not without some more forced walking. This is where Nemesis's evolution gimmick truly starts getting bad, because he changes into this big nothing burger of a creature that just lacks the sauce of his humanoid form. This tall, hulking, imposing menace transforming into a rejected devil-may-cry enemy, not even a boss, just a basic enemy, causes him to lose what little luster he's had all game, and it's exacerbated by how poorly designed the boss fight is. I'm gonna be totally honest with you, I'm just gonna talk about Nemesis fights 2 and 3 in one go because they're the exact same fight, and I really don't want to retread the same ground like 5 minutes from now. So, let's get started. Nemesis will take damage from you for a while before doing a battle cry and running around in a circle. Yeah, that's kind of the gist of the fight. All you have to do is fire mines from your grenade launcher while he's resting on top of the clock tower, and then attack him while he's down, rinse and repeat a number of times. If you're low, you can check the cars nearby and clear the map until it's blue. It's piss easy, excruciatingly repetitive, and very drawn out. It's the one part of the game that finishes any slower than the average Radiohead fan in bed, and it just so happens to be the one part of the game that moves at a damn snail's pace. Now, the main difference between the second and third fight is that the third fight, 1, throws ads at you, which is annoying, and 2, has Nemesis hiding behind these numbered generators that you have to fire explosive rounds at instead of a clock tower that he stands on top of. But what I think affects the gameplay more than either of those two things is that Nemesis 3 is even more of a bullet sponge than Nemesis 2 was. This means that you're likely to not have enough ammo to deal sufficient enough damage to him, meaning you'll be forced to Dark Souls him with dodge rolls and knife attacks, which can slow things down even more. Yeah, I kind of hate these fights, and they dealt such psychological damage to me that I'm seriously going to skip talking about Nemesis 3 later, so I'm just getting it out of the way right now. I need a drink. After killing Nemesis, Jill gets stabbed by one of Nemesis's tendrils and infected with the T-virus, causing her to fall unconscious and be left unattended for half a day. Carlos eventually finds her and takes her to the hospital Bard's suspected to be at, where he's now particularly motivated to find Bard because he's Carlos, and Carlos's role in this game is to save Jill, be hot doing it, and pretty much nothing else. Now, thankfully, this is by far the most expansive and best part of the game, complete with a substantial amount of puzzling you have to do, and lots of enemies that you have to either evade or fight depending on how your resources are looking. Your goal is clear from the start. Get through the door to Bard. Unfortunately, It's voice activated, meaning you have to find a tape to play on a tape recorder with Bard's voice playing in it. This requires you to find the key to the staff room, which on its own leads you down a sprawling path up and down the hospital searching for different clues and items that interweave. Wait, scavenging for survival? Turning exploration into a puzzle that feeds into other puzzles? Quest items requiring quest items that require other quest items? Difficulty? Now this is Resident Evil. Except, the game can't seem to go very far without stumbling somewhere. The Hunter enemies. Now they're a breath of fresh air, aesthetically and gameplay-wise, but they're almost too plentiful, and the way they scale with difficulty adjustment becomes comical. Parry me once, shame on you. Parry me twice, I cut your fucking head off from full health. Thankfully, it could have been way worse. But unfortunately, the Hunters do cause the second half of the hospital to drop off in quality just a little bit, and it's a little annoying. Eventually, after some admittedly really solid exploration, you get the tape and make your way to Bard's office, where it's revealed Bard was murdered and Umbrella is trying to destroy T-virus vaccines to cover up its involvement with the outbreak. Thankfully, one vaccine is left, and Carlos takes it so as to cure Jill of her affliction. While she recovers, Carlos is forced to defend her. Defending Jill's actually pretty solid, even if a little unremarkable. It's a pretty simple matter of shoot the zombies until they're dead. And you do that, and it feels pretty good. Action versus horror is always the ongoing debate in Resident Evil, but I think this is a good instance of action that doesn't undermine the horror elements. Enemies pose a significant threat just as they did throughout the rest of the hospital section, and it's arguably better at creating survival horror tension than in the city streets and sewers. If all the action set pieces in the game were this engaging and fun, I would like this game. Love it even. Unfortunately, this game is constantly suffering from an identity crisis and it doesn't know what it wants to be. Sometimes it wants to be a remake of Resident Evil 3. Sometimes it wants to be an action game. Sometimes it wants to be a worse version of Resident Evil 2 Remake. So it ends up being this hodgepodge of the three and doesn't do particularly well at any one thing. One game of World at War zombies later, and it's revealed that Raccoon City is going to be decimated in a missile strike, so Carlos makes his way down into the lab to search for more vaccines in hopes of being able to convince the government not to launch those missiles. Jill has that other trauma dream we talked about at the beginning of the video, and finally wakes up from her coma. From here, she has access to pick every lock Carlos couldn't open, allotting her a wealth of resources. The hospital takes yet another W in doing this, as it was such a good idea that it was reintroduced in Resident Evil 9 when Leon gets to traverse the care center immediately after Grace leaves it. I know it's not the biggest win in the world, but please let me have this. This game has been making me lose my goddamn mind, and I want something, anything to like about it at this point. And trust me, this is the last time the game will be good. Speak of the devil, it's time to say goodbye to good game design because you're going to the facility. Have you ever wanted to walk around a bland industrial environment? Have you ever wanted zombies, but with more health? Have you ever wanted to see Nikolai be a villain for exactly 10 seconds over the course of 2 hours? Then the facility might just be for you. Now experience a smaller playable area. Poorly designed halls that are more annoying than stressful to navigate. Gammas! You can still pretend they don't exist. A simple find three things formula with nothing else going on. I don't like this part of the game. I find the very simple premise of find three things with nothing else going on whatsoever to be lazy and rushed, especially in a level so small and with so little going on in it. It worked in the Resident Evil 2 Remake's RPD because finding each medallion was tied to multiple different sub-objectives that required critical thinking and efficient pathing. This facility does none of that, instead railroading you directly from fuse to fuse, giving you a straight shot to your objective with no pathing required at all. It attempts to introduce friction instead by putting paleheads in your way, which are essentially souped up zombies that need to be hit with high single shot damage in order to die. Now this would be kinda cool if 1, these weren't an asset reuse from Ghost Survivors in RE3 Remake, and 2, you're fucking Jill Valentine and can just choose not to engage with this system at all because you have a dodge roll. So in practice, you're walking or rolling forward, occasionally killing an enemy here or there, and the section's done in the blink of an eye. It's this empty, lifeless facsimile of a Resident Evil level and adds nothing to the story other than a little bit of Nikolai dialogue. It's truly unfortunate that following the best part of the entire game is one of the most forgettable areas in the series. So you might ask, how could it possibly get worse? You can't make this shit up. Welcome to the Nest Lab, where Jill's mission, should she choose to accept it, is to make a new vaccine for the T-virus. This involves finding an antigen and an adjuvant, combining them into a vaccine base, and then putting it into a synthesizer to create the vaccine itself. On your way to find the two ingredients, you'll run into some, paleheads. You can pretty much ignore them, but they're certainly there, and they, exist. Oh, right, hunters, they're here too, sometimes. One time. They're still pretty cool, I guess. They're still hunters. It's Resident Evil 3 Remake. Once you've gotten your vaccine base, your path is obstructed by this super challenging puzzle where you have to math everything out and get the right amount of each color in each test tube, and it's super difficult and it takes a lot of thought and a lot of critical thinking, and oh, I think I finished it like 5 seconds ago. That's a little embarrassing. Wait, what do you mean we're done with the lab already? Is that a Nemesis boss fight? Did Jill just did Jill just shoot Nemesis with a railgun? Oh, we're talking to Nikolai now, and the game just ended. That's the end of the game. Okay. Well, okay. I guess I should expand on it a little bit at least. Nikolai is revealed to be playing double agent for an anonymous contractor that wants to sabotage Umbrella and collect combat data on their bioweapons. Hence why he wants to stop the outbreak's containment and sick Umbrella's various man-made horrors on Jill. When confronted on the helipad, he destroys the vaccine, and there's a pretty drawn-out fight scene between him and Carlos. Eventually, Nikolai is left behind as Jill and Carlos escape the city. Yeah, that's pretty much it. You don't really... I mean... I guess we get a, I guess we get a motive for Nikolai. He wants money. He's a pretty bad person. That's about it. You do not understand how dumbfounded I was when I watched the credits roll. Now, you might have noticed that a lot of the back half of this overview went by really, really quickly. I swear that wasn't the result of me getting lazy or burning out. That's just how the game is. There is so much nothing that when you trim out all the fat, the story is exactly as in-depth as a 3-paragraph Wikipedia summary. And the Wikipedia summary of this game's plot is exactly 3 paragraphs. I wanted to make a much more in-depth critique of each individual character, but the game only gives depth at all to Carlos and Jill, and poorly at that. Mikhail exists for all of 2 scenes, and is better known for saying shitbird than actually saying or doing literally anything else. Nikolai does so little in the story that he's only considered the main antagonist because it'd be fucking embarrassing for Nemesis if it was him. Tyrell exists solely to tell Jill about the missiles. Brad gets gangbanged by zombies and then turned into Swiss cheese before he gets any fleshing out whatsoever. The only 2 characters with a modicum of dimension are the damsel in distress character assassination victim and the White Knight character assassination victim. And when it comes to the story, that's probably the most frustrating thing about this game. It has barely any interest in existing as is, considering it's all of 6 hours long, so you better know that it doesn't care one bit about at least being well written for those 6 hours. The game is pretty great when it's trying to be a Resident Evil game, and I can confidently say I had a wonderful time in the hospital. The issue is, these moments have too little time to breathe, and they're broken up by far too many cinematics and forced walking segments. Like, the foundation is solid, it's just that the second it starts building upon itself, Capcom sends a fucking wrecking crew to obliterate that foundation with hammers. In the end, I can see why people will call this a good game, bad remake. The core of the game does imply something really good. The potential was there, and if you've played Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, you know what could have been. But unfortunately, what could have been is not what was, and instead, we have what I can confidently say is a bad game.